Hi class, welcome back to the week. Hopefully if you're watching this video, you have already taken the test that I asked you to prepare for last week. And if you haven't, I would go ahead and stop this video because this is going to contain a lot of transition information to chapter 28. And none of this video is on the test. I've already given you the test questions. Everything you need to know for the test we covered last week and the week before. And so if you're watching this video, you're just going to add more information that is not necessary and it's going to confuse you and get in the way. So if you have not already taken the test for this week, go ahead and do that. If you picked up a packet of paper, I put yellow legal pad paper in your packets this week so we could take it the way we normally do in class. If you didn't pick up packet and you don't have yellow paper at home, that's completely fine. Just take it on regular paper. So we are hoping then that you have already finished the test. And you might be wondering, well, what about chapter 27? Because she didn't assign chapter 27 for reading, and that's correct. I'm not going to formally assign chapter 27 for reading. You certainly may do it, but I'm not going to require it. And the reason for that is because we're going to use this as a transition chapter between World War I and World War II. There is some information at the end of chapter 27 that's political in nature, about the Dawes Act, about the new German government, about some of the unrest in France. And so we will cover that, but I'm going to cover that as part of chapter 28. And we're going to use 27 as a socio-cultural chapter to talk about the changes in thought, in faith, in art, and in mass culture. We're going to talk about those things before going on to chapter 28. So unlike the previous weeks of online schooling, we're going to end this week with you taking a quiz on chapter 28. So we're going to start out the week with a test. We're going to do transition chapter in the middle, and we're going to end the week with you reading and taking a test on chapter 28. So there'll be a little bit less video than there normally is during a week this week, but there was a lot last week. Also, in this transition chapter, there's a lot of material about art, about science, about music, and I am going to use some supplementary video like I did last week, but a little bit more this week. I don't want you to feel like you have to watch every single thing that I put in there for support, but I will explain to you what I do want you to make good use of as we get into chapter 27. And then, like I said, the end of this week, we'll get into chapter 28, which is dictatorships and World War II. That's going to be a big chapter for us, big chapter of importance. On Wednesday of this week, we will get together. You're probably watching this past Wednesday, to be honest. But on this Wednesday, we will get together and talk a little bit more about our DBQ from last week and see how you did with it, and talk a little bit more about the upcoming AP exam. Okay, I'm going to get into chapter 27, which our text calls the age of anxiety. And so this phrase was coined by people in a later decade, but the idea of the age of anxiety, a time of tumult, a time of changing thought, a time of questioning. And of course, this all came from World War I. And I'm not going to belabor the point. Obviously, we looked at those death tolls of World War I. We looked at the damage to people. We talked about the futility of trench warfare on the Western Front. We talked about the massive casualties. We talked about the Russian Revolution and massive expenditure and loss of life, and people seeing the results of what the Industrial Revolution could do on a death scale. And with all of that came a lot of questioning about the world, about its meaning, and about what on earth we're doing here. And so we're going to enter into a time of what we call uncertainty of thought. And we're not going to be able to do a whole philosophy class here, unfortunately. We used to have a philosophy class at Seven Rivers. That doesn't fit into our schedule right now. But we are going to go into talking a little bit about some of the uncertainties in modern thought. And like I said, it's not going to be a whole philosophy class, but it will, I think, give you a good understanding of some of the thought that's out there. Some of this thought is going to conflict. Some of this thought is going to go together. Some of it will be a little bit confusing. And then it will produce offshoots in the areas of art, music, psychology, all kinds of things. And so we're going to get right into the different types of thought that came about in the age of anxiety. And I'm going to pause this and get a cup of coffee so that I can do this without yawning. Okay, friends, so sorry about that. We're getting back into the uncertainty of modern thought. Now, I know that it's a struggle to continue to do online schooling. I hope that you're trucking along. You guys seem like you're doing very well. Sometimes it can be hard as we continue to go forward and we don't get to do things the way we normally did. For this chapter, usually I was able to assign out reports, and so I had to spend all day today making a whole new PowerPoint to do this, because usually students are doing this. I'm actually using one of my former students' PowerPoints from 2016 that I added a lot to for the art portion. So we're none of us getting to do the things that we necessarily normally like to do, but I hope that will keep your spirits up and keep your thoughts up. These are some really important things to talk about, and they might be applicable to the AP exam, because even though it's ending in with the last period of 19 up to 1914, a lot of this thought started even a little bit before that, at least originated in the 1880s, and then really accelerated after World War I's effects in regular people. So let's start talking about uncertainty in modern thought. So certainly, when you're looking at the pre-1914 world compared to the post-1914 world, your text does a great job of contrasting these two periods. Whereas in pre-1914, we could say that people generally believed that faith was something of value. They believed in reason in order to figure out the world. They believed generally in progress, that man would continue to move forward over time, that he would continue to invent, he would continue to make forward movement in thinking and economics. We believed in the rights of the individual, and so that meant that there were burgeoning rights. It was taking a long time, as you remember, but the rights of the individual to vote, the rights of women, the rights of workers, the rights for good working conditions. These things were universally believed by man. Even if they didn't all happen right away, it was still thought that this was a good thing and that individuals should have human rights. And there was a general sense of optimism about the future. But after World War I, with the destruction, the death, the inhumanity, we entered into a different period, a period of irrationality, a period where there had been untold violence in the world that had been witnessed massively by the lost generation, by fathers, brothers, young men, sons who had gone to war and had seen really the worst of humanity. And I think there had been worse before World War I, certainly. But the destruction of human life on the level that the Industrial Revolution allowed that to happen, and the new weapons of war that came about in World War I between barbed wire, poison gas, tanks, the beginning of the use of airplanes in war, although that wasn't highly featured, machine guns. All of this playing into modern warfare certainly brought about a much higher and much more gruesome death count. And really, the frustration on the Western Front brought with that a meaninglessness, a lack of understanding about what this was really about. And that's what we mean by disorientation. There's a disorientation with life in general, and what does it really mean? And then a serious pessimism, a pessimism to say maybe the world isn't going forward in a positive way. Maybe things aren't going to get better. Maybe mankind is animalistic, as the text brings up. And so you can see there's quite a contrast between the pre-1914 thought and post-1914 thought. And so what we want to get into is some of the specifics about modern thought. Now, all of these modern thought categories could probably fall loosely into the idea of existentialism, but we are going to attack it piece by piece, and we're going to start with probably the definitive existentialist, who is Friedrich Nietzsche. So let's start talking about existentialism. Before we do, we're going to look at this quote that was mentioned in your text from a essay called "The Crisis of the Mind" by Paul Valery. And this is said to sum up the thoughts of modern thought. The storm has died away, and still we are restless, uneasy as if the storm were about to break. Almost all the affairs of men remain in a terrible uncertainty. We think of what has disappeared, and we are almost destroyed by what has been destroyed. We do not know what will be born, and we fear the future, not without reason. Doubt and disorder are in us and with us. There is no thinking man, however shrewd or learned he may be, who can hope to dominate this anxiety, to escape from this impression of darkness. That's not exactly a great way to start out a century. But that is the dominant thinking, especially on the intellectual and educated elites, and how that passed down to the more common man after the war experience of World War I. So let's look at the four new types of thought that come about in this period of kind of dark visions of the future. First, existentialism. And then a Christian existentialism. Some people might argue with that categorization. We'll talk a little bit about it, and then we'll see if we think we've got a good description of it. Logical positivism. And then I want to also talk about modern psychology as one of the new ways of thought. And then we're going to conclude by talking also about some modern scientific thought that we will conclude with. So there's all kinds of new types of thinking, new types of thought that one living in this time period might have been exposed to. And like I said earlier, some of this might conflict with other thought, and that's certainly okay. So as you're a person living in the new and modern 21st century, what is it that you are going to be confronted with as far as your understanding of the world and the way it works and the thinking? So we're going to start with existentialism. So the most dominant thinker of existentialism is Friedrich Nietzsche. Now, as you study future literature, probably literature you've already studied, but especially literature that you're going to encounter in your senior year, whether you're taking the dual enrollment class or whether you're taking the college prep course, you're going to come across Nietzsche's thought and really contradictions of Nietzsche's thought, especially amongst some of the Russian writers that you'll study. Friedrich Nietzsche's existentialism, it was basically a embracing of this meaninglessness, or maybe how he would have put it is looking the meaninglessness square in the face, right? He talked about this idea that if you stare at the abyss, it stares back at you, and that this can have this effect of making you into something that you weren't before. Nietzsche rejected traditional morality and rationality. So he had begun as a professor of the classics, and he grew to reject everything that Western civilization had taught about rationality and about reason, and about morality and about what man is and how he should be controlled. If you look back even at the ancient philosophers, they had this idea that ration should control emotion. When you think about the things that Aristotle talked about finding the golden mean between two extremes. When you talked about the idea of not being a slave to your passions, that the classic writers would have echoed throughout time and would have been picked up on by Renaissance writers, by Reformation thinkers. Well, that's all out the window, because Friedrich Nietzsche says that all that's foolishness. It's been overemphasized. It's a silly idea about the West. And he says that it's time to grow up. He says God is dead. And what he means is not that Jesus did not resurrect from the dead. Sometimes there's a misunderstanding about that in Christianity. Nietzsche didn't believe in the deity of Christ at all. What he was saying when he said God is dead is, as your text explains, that he was killed by modern people of faith who really had no actual belief system. In other words, he says people who truly, they claim to be Christians, but even they don't believe. So God is dead. He's a dead concept. He's irrelevant is more what Nietzsche is trying to say. And so how is he irrelevant? Well, actually, Nietzsche has one of the most conceited philosophies that I've ever come across in my lifetime. And it didn't do him any practical favors because he ended up kind of going nuts and becoming kind of a freak show and an addict. And his relative that was taking care of him in order to pay the bills would charge money for people to peer in to the window in his door and look at the really kind of animalistic soul that he had become. It's kind of a tragic end, but Nietzsche was just self-aggrandized, and really he called for a rejection of the traditional morality, but he said most people aren't going to do that. Most people are going to be stuck in their traditional morality, their traditional way of looking at things, and he said they will be part of what he called the herd, or the slave morality, the slave mentality. If you hear people talking about, sheeple today, they're talking about this idea. It's a very Nietzschean idea, the idea that most people will abide by traditional morals, traditional things that hem them in and block them in, but it's only the true master morality, okay, the Uberman, the Superman, that can rise above this mentality and develop a morality of their own, instead of taking on this normal morality that has these ideas of right and wrong and ideas of a God who sets those parameters on humans. No, all human life is meaningless. All human life is darkness. Humans are violent and animalistic. And so once you have looked that abyss in the face and you have discovered it to be true, you can take one of two actions. You can kill yourself, which Nietzsche thought was an admirable thing to do because it was a way that you could show that you had faced your reality. Or you could, and this is if you don't want to become a member of the herd, by the way, I guess that's the third option. Or you could be like Nietzsche and you could become a Superman who has risen above the herd mentality and the slave morality and has become a true hero. How do you become a true hero? Well, you make your own morality, and you make this morality by the decisions that you make that are so bold as to reject all previous ideas about morality. You set the morality because you've realized life is meaningless, and in some way, shape, or form, you can make it have meaning by discovering that it has no meaning. In other words, the meaning comes out of your maturity to outgrow God, who's dead anyway, and traditional morality. And now that you have grown up, you show yourself to be a real man, a real person who can take on the realities. And in your action, you have grown up. He talks about this idea of that once we were out on the sea being tossed by waves, and things like wars or sadness or evil, what we perceive as evil, could toss us around at sea. But now, with our new master morality, we have gone out onto the open sea and we've conquered it, and that we are the masters of that domain, and we're the ones in control because we realize that evil or good is not even a thing, right? His works, Untimely Meditation, that's supposed to say meditations, not medications, sorry. Untimely Meditations on the Genealogy of Morals and Thus Spake Zarathustra are probably some of his most famous works. This Nietzschean existentialism was most popular on the continent, and particularly in Germany. We're going to talk now about more of a fringe existentialism that came about. By the way, if you can see that this idea of the master morality and rejecting what people would conventionally call right and wrong can fit right into the mentality that comes about in 1930s Germany with exterminating people groups, with dehumanizing, calling people subspecies. This is not an attractive philosophy by any means, and it didn't offer a lot of hope to Europeans. The French took So in France, we have the existentialism with perhaps a little bit less brutality, but I don't think it's any less of the emptiness that you find in existential philosophy when you keep talking about the purpose of really nothingness. And that's interesting because Jean-Paul Sartre, he wrote his most famous work, Being and Nothingness. He also wrote a fictional work called Nausea. So you can kind of get the drift of where these guys are headed. This picture here is of Sartre and his female companion of 51 years, Simone de Beauvoir. She's famous for a work called The Second Sex, and she was considered one of France's first modern feminists. Now, I just got to tell you that their 51-year non-marital relationship also included a mistress of his, and Beauvoir wrote about this in protest of the relationship that Sartre had with this outside female, and he said some very offensive things that most feminists wouldn't take very kindly. So he talked about the fact that, you know, yes, he had this other woman in his life and perhaps other women, but he said Simone de Beauvoir, because she reviews my books and I review hers, she is my most privileged companion. It doesn't exactly sound like something that a modern feminist would be okay with. And she did protest this relationship in a sense, and she talked about, he said, you know, everyone's free. Philosophically, everyone can choose to be free. But she famously made the remark that how free can you be in a harem, right? So there's some tension in their relationship. Let's not make this into some kind of modern love story without really understanding what goes along with the rejection of any kind of traditional morality or beliefs about right and wrong. But being in nothingness was Sartre's way of dealing with the tragedies of World War I and modern life. And he believed that, unlike a previous work by another philosopher, Being and Doing, he's contrasting that by saying there is no doing, right? The doing is really nothingness. And yet he's going to say some things that seem very contradictory. So let's look at two of his phrases to help understand what we mean. So Sartre is, in his pessimism and darkness, a little bit more optimistic than maybe Nietzsche, all right? So Sartre does believe that you can choose a moral act, a moral right, but he believes that you are the one who infuses that act with morality. So that's a little bit confusing. To help understand it, let's look at one of his ideas: existence precedes essence. So we as Christians would believe that essence precedes existence. In other words, the essence of God and the essence of who he is in his being, in his character, in his creativity, that gives meaning to our existence. Okay, so because God embodies what is true, because God embodies what is good, what is beautiful, then we can know those things because we are image bearers and because we can communicate with God even through words in a mystical way that he's provided for, through the idea of prayer and through the Holy Spirit as well. Sartre would say all of that is ridiculous, that in fact existence precedes essence. It is when man realizes his own existence is first. Okay, so practically speaking, there is no God. Okay, there is no creative force. You exist. He believes in atheism, all right? He is a true atheist in that embracing sense. Did he talk about God? Yes, but he talked about that with a lower G in the sense of what you make up to make your moral decisions. Okay, and so he says existence precedes essence. So first, you squarely look at it and you realize, okay, I'm a being, I'm out here, and there's no meaning to the world. So what am I going to do about that? Right? Whereas Nietzsche says, well, kill yourself or become a master of the herd and lord it over everybody else and turn morality inside out and do what you want to do and take what you want to take. Sartre says perhaps you can find some essence in your own existence. So Sartre, for instance, he joined the French resistance movement against Hitler, and he believed that doing that was a moral act. This is in World War II, of course. He believed that he was doing right, but he believed that the right that he was doing was something that he was giving meaning to. In other words, it wasn't right because of some outlying moral principle that it's wrong to gas people and treat people like subhumans and take land from others, but because he had come to the realization of what was good. And so therefore, in his action, he was rising above the nothingness and infusing life with some kind of not ultimate meaning, but meaning for the individual. All right. And so this was his somewhat contradictory idea. That leads us to understand his comment that man is condemned to be free. He wasn't saying that through this you can find happiness. He was just saying that you can find a reason not to kill yourself, okay? But man, to Sartre, is condemned to be free. In other words, man has choices, but you shouldn't look at that as a good thing, like the classical liberals did, like the Christians did, like the Greeks did. Okay, there's no liberal education that allows man to be free because he's a thinker. There's no libertas, okay? There's no study of humanities for the sake of image bearing. No. Man is condemned to be free. The problem is that he's born into this world of meaninglessness, but somehow with that meaninglessness comes freedom. Man has this freedom to choose in the nothingness. And so it's a particular entrapping here. And as you can tell, Sartre both lived his life in a contradictory moral fashion, and he wrote his philosophy in a lot of contradictory terms. But French existentialism was a bit more palatable, maybe, for living life, in some ways at least, than was German existentialism under Nietzsche. Now, let's talk about what existentialism looks like on the other side of the Atlantic and on the island of Britain. So here we talk about logical positivism. Sometimes it's also called logical empiricism. The logical positivists basically say, yes, life is meaningless, but they don't believe that everything is meaningless, okay? What is meaningless to a logical positivist is anything that cannot be quantified by science or math. In other words, if you cannot logically think about something in a mathematical way, or if you cannot scientifically experiment on a thing, there's really no use speaking about it. While they did not outright say that there's no such thing as God, or that there's no such thing as love or morality or joy or sadness, okay, or justice, a logical positivist would say those things are outside the scope of anything that man can talk about. Those things lie outside of what we can accurately and effectively deal with. And so logical positivism says, let's not waste our time with those things. And let's instead deal with the things that we can prove, the things that are physical. In other words, it basically negates the metaphysical world for any sake. Okay, it's basically saying anything you're contemplating in those areas is a waste of time. So God, freedom, morality, those are personal preferences, and we should really leave them out of our scope of thinking because of what one cannot speak of that one must keep silent. It's his way of saying to speak about God or morality or freedom, those things are arrogant because you can't experiment on them and because you can't mathematically prove them. That's kind of ironic to me, because to me that seems to be an arrogant statement of itself. In other words, if I can't experiment on it or mathematically theorize about it, then it must not exist or be worthy of my time, energy, or thought. It's a very, very limiting idea. Even the text, okay, which is not a Christian book, makes the comment that logical positivism drastically reduces the scope of philosophy. And it says that it doesn't offer a lot of hope to people in the world, and it certainly doesn't, okay? But this was far more popular in England and the United States. The logical positivists, they don't get into as much of the darkness of their own reality and thought. This may be partially because England and then the United States, certainly well after that, experienced far less of the death and destruction of World War I than did the continent. That certainly plays in here. Also, because England and the United States had a history of classical liberalism, which does believe in individual rights and does believe in the ideas of individual expression and free will. And the other philosophical traditions are a little bit more mechanistic. They're a little bit more advanced in their rejection of faith than is England and the United States at this point in the 1900s. And so logical positivism becomes much more popular in the United States and in England. Sorry about the couple of misspellings on this slide, but we'll keep going. That says, of what one cannot speak, of that one must keep silent. That's Wittgenstein's mentality, who was one of the largest spokesmen for logical positivism. All right, we're going to move on and talk about Christian existentialism. Now, this may seem to you to be very contradictory. How can a Christian believe that the world is meaningless or without purpose or without meaning? Well, the Christian existentialists are called this, perhaps for lack of a better term, because they're dealing with the same problems that the rest of the people post-World War I are dealing with, that lack of understanding, that hopelessness, facing death, facing mass destruction, facing a meaningless war in a sense. But they do still have a high regard for the scriptures in some cases and for God, and they still believe in faith. So how do they reconcile those two things? Well, the way they do it is by really taking their faith and kind of separating it from reason and ration. So this is a very interesting thing. Guys, ever since the Reformation, okay, with a few exceptions like Jansenism, Pietism, mysticism, okay? Ever since the Reformation, and even the Catholic tradition, there has been a large amount of emphasis in the Christian faith on logic and reason. Remember that Luther and his Catholic enemies are calling for debates. They're writing against each other. Erasmus and Luther spent tons of time formulating arguments and writing tracts against each other, attracting the notice of even kings and theologians of the day, Aquinas, Augustine. These were all writers who wrote about their faith and thought and reason. Well, World War I kind of put a kink in all that. And so it brought about the modern day writings of Karl Barth, who you see here on the right, but it also revived the writings of a rather little known figure, Danish figure, named Soren Kierkegaard. So we're going to start with Kierkegaard. So Kierkegaard was an 1800s thinker, a Dane, who had basically said that you cannot get to God through reason. Okay, he is not the first and he won't be the last of thinkers to think about this. But he says you cannot arrive at your beliefs about God by reason. You must arrive there by faith. Now, Let's take a minute and ask ourselves, do we believe this as Christians and as Christians of our faith tradition? The answer to this is that we do not believe that one can meet God completely and utterly through reason. Okay? We don't believe that you can reach God without faith. Right? The Bible says without faith, it is impossible to please God. The Bible says that we are saved by grace through faith. And so we understand that this is a gift of God, right? But we do believe that reason, that our faith is number one, reasonable, and number two, that we must reason along with our faith. Whereas the Christian existentialists more say that reason and ration must be set aside if you want to come to God. Okay, that's their key, because remember, the in thing to do, the way of thinking, is to resist ration and reason. And so in his work, Sickness Unto Death, Kierkegaard calls for this leap of faith. He says, you have to reach God through taking this leap. Let go of your reason and ration and take this leap into God. If you were to read a lot of Kierkegaard, I think that a lot of it would resonate with you. If you took his individual quotes, you might even find some things that are very, very meaningful and even very, very true. But Kierkegaard does have this issue where he believes that the setting aside of reason is what's allowing us to know God in an emotional, and in a faith-driven way. But his leap is a bit of a blind leap, which is not what we believe as Reformed Christians about our faith. Nonetheless, I don't think that all of Soren Kierkegaard's stuff should be completely discounted by modern Christians. You have to take him in the context of the time period that he's living and writing in, and understand that he is looking forward through a lot of psychological and rational change in his lifetime, and he's trying to preserve Christianity through this. Does he do that perfectly theologically? I think the answer is no. Now, Karl Barth, his philosophy came through and out of World War I, and his idea is indeed that faith is granted through grace, not through reason. So he just flat out says, faith is a gift of God. Okay, he's right here on the right. Faith is a gift of God, but it's kind of like it comes like that. Okay, it comes to you. There is no reasoning. In fact, you got to get all that reasoning out of your way completely. He does take this a step further than Soren Kierkegaard. Whereas Kierkegaard sees too much reason, too much ration as an impediment to taking a leap of faith, Barth almost draws a much more solid line and says, if you're bringing ration and reason to the table, you cannot know God. He has got to give this to you as a gift of faith, and it's got to come apart from the rational mind. It has to be infused into you. You might be saying, oh, but I thought we believed that. Yes, but we don't believe that God must overcome our ration or get rid of our ration, because we believe that the way that God interacts with us is as his image bearers, and as his image bearers we are given, yes, emotion, but also ration. Okay, and all of those things are corrupted by the fall. So what do we believe as Christians? Well, we believe that our emotion, our ration, our spiritual man, all of those things have been damaged by the fall. But yet they are an integral part of what it means to be human. And so God renews those things. He gives us a new heart, and those image-bearing qualities are reinvigorated, through the relationship with God. Whereas Barth is more saying this part of man needs to be rejected for this grace infusion that just comes upon us when we choose to let go of the idea of reasoning through. So he might even come close to saying that our faith isn't just in some way absurd, but that's a good thing, because then it allows us to accept it by grace. Okay? So that's Christian existentialism. All right, let's take a little quiz, shall we? What if we look at these quotes that I have here, and we try to figure out who they might belong to, which of the thoughts that we've gone over might these quotes belong to? Let's take the first one. The real question of life after death isn't whether or not it exists, but even if it does, what problem this really solves. Anybody have a guess as to which of the philosophies that might go to? The real question of life after death isn't whether or not it exists, but even if it does, what problem this really solves. Try to answer that. I'm going to wait just a second, sip my coffee. Okay, see if you said logical positivism, right? It's that philosophy that says we're not saying that there's no life after death. What we're saying is it doesn't matter, right? He says that's not even the question you should be asking, because why are we dealing with something that we can't prove mathematically, right? You get it? You get what he's saying there? That's a Heidegger quote right there. These are kind of fun to do, I think. I wish that we were together in the classroom. In the consciousness of the truth he has perceived, man now sees everywhere only the awfulness of the absurdity of existence, and loathing seizes him. Which of the people that we talked about do you think would have the word loathing in one of his quotes, right? In the consciousness of the truth he has perceived, man now sees everywhere only the awfulness or absurdity of existence, and loathing seizes him, right? If you are guessing that you're staring into the abyss that is Friedrich Nietzsche, you're right, okay? Loathing life, loathing existence, loathing meaning, and a loathing life until you become the master morality guy. You hate life and it makes you sick. You stare into the abyss, right? That's Friedrich Nietzsche. All right, what about this one? If I am capable of grasping God objectively, I do not believe, but precisely because I cannot do this, I must believe. If I'm capable of grasping God objectively, I do not believe, but precisely because I cannot do this, I must believe. So here we have a person saying, if I can get God inside my head, right? If I can conceive of him in here objectively in my mind, then maybe he's not really worth believing in. But because I can't do that, I say, you know what? That makes me believe. That is our good friend, Soren Kierkegaard, okay? He is trying to kind of get us to say, do you really believe that you can wrap your mind around God? And as Christians, we do not believe that we can fully conceive of God. But Kierkegaard, he would take it a little further and say, you shouldn't even be trying. We don't agree with that, okay? But that's Soren Kierkegaard. How about this one? First word's the key. Nothingness lies coiled in the heart of a human being like a worm. There's a nice uplifting thought for you on a Thursday or a Friday, whatever day of the week you're watching this. Nothingness lies coiled in the heart of a human being like a worm. Whose book is called Being and Nothingness? That is our good friend, Jean-Paul Sartre, right? Nothingness is in our hearts. It's in there, right? He doesn't necessarily talk about loathing, but he certainly talks about this thing that's in us and it's sticking in us and it's staying with us and it's in our heart. Maybe we can join the French Resistance and find some meaning. Maybe we can have affairs with multiple women and find some meaning. That's pretty sad stuff about Jean-Paul Sartre. But that is nevertheless his quote, French existentialism, right? And then lastly, faith is not an art. Faith is not an achievement. Faith is not a good work of which some may boast, while others can excuse themselves with a shrug of the shoulders for not being capable of it. It is a decisive insight of faith itself that all of us are incapable of faith in ourselves, whether we think of its preparation, beginning, continuation, or completion. In this respect, believers understand unbelievers, skeptics, and atheists better than they understand themselves. Unlike unbelievers, they regard the impossibility of faith as necessary, not accidental. My friends, this is Karl Barth, right? You might like part of this, and you might say, oh, I think this guy is just like us because he's saying it's by grace. Hang on a second, okay? We agree that faith is not some good work of which some may boast while others can excuse themselves. We agree with that. And we agree that we are incapable of faith in ourselves, okay? But what he is saying is that it cannot be thought about, okay? It cannot be thought about. It cannot be prepared for. We cannot have anything to do with its continuation, its completion. We do believe that God is responsible for continuing the good work that he has started in us. But we believe, for instance, in sanctification, that through the Holy Spirit, we are pursuing holiness. This is after we have received the gift of faith, and that we're working in cooperation with the Holy Spirit, not quenching the Holy Spirit, to continue to grow in our faith. Bart would disagree with all of that. He would say, I don't want to hear about anything that man is bringing to the table because there is meaninglessness and nothingness in man. He has nothing to do, nothing to say. Anything happening that's spiritual at all is like a lightning bolt that hits you. It's nothing that you're thinking about doing, preparing for. And I don't think that that is a biblical view of our faith. Although we would agree with Bart in some things, he takes it a little bit too much to the extreme in rejecting what God does in a human being to make them capable, all right? Because we do believe that in the total depravity of man, certainly. But Bart takes this a little bit too far and divides man. And we believe that God deals with us in both our intellect, our reason, our will, our emotion, our spirit. All right. So that's a fun little exercise, wasn't it? We're going to move on. I'm going to talk about some of the new physics. Okay, this is not just physics. This is science in general. It's in their section in your book called The New Physics. I'm going to point out these very quickly, and I put some video up, some video support, I called it, for you to take a look at some quick videos on some of these scientists in case you're able to use these in your DBQ in some way. I do not know, of course, what the DBQ is going to be on. This will probably be somewhat outside the period, but if they pick something very late, they would be people who would still be within the period. Okay, this is Pierre and Marie Curie, pioneers in the area of radiation. And in the beginning of the use of radiation in its application to human health. And so Nobel Award-winning prize couple from Poland. Then next we have John Rutherford, who is responsible for the discussion of the structure and the description of the atom, taking things much further as a pioneer into atomic structure and really laying the basis for modern day nuclear physics. We have Max Planck, who was responsible for the discussion of quantum physics and the idea that the structure of what a body can give off in heat is much more limited. He is said to have destroyed classical physics and brought about quantum physics, or the idea that physics has limitations that one can count. And then Albert Einstein, the theory of both special and general relativity, E equals mc squared, and all of the dealings with the science behind time and light. These new scientists certainly exploded the assumptions of the old scientific world. Remember when we studied the scientific revolution chapter and it was moving beyond the crystal spheres? This is a new physics, and I like the way that the text kind of describes this at one point. Of it takes it down to the very, very minute. In other words, you're destroying the old science by taking it down to the microscopic and then to the macroscopic. You're thinking of everything from what an atom looks like, right? We're not even dealing with a cell anymore, but what does the inside of a nucleus look like? And then we're also at the same time talking about the existence of black holes, and so and the speed of light. And so we're talking about science on both a minuscule scale, and we're talking about it on a macroscopic scale. And these new scientists certainly explode the old way of thinking, and it brings about uncertainty, but it also brings about newness, and it certainly changes the world. This is a game changer for the future as we head into discoveries, not just medically, but also in the area of computers, communication, space travel, all kinds of things that are unlocked by these scientists. Watch the video support on these guys so that you can have a good understanding of some of these scientists. Okay, guys, we're going to conclude this with a talk about Freudian psychology. This is Sigmund Freud. And if you don't know a lot about Sigmund Freud, you probably do know a little bit about him just from pop culture and just from watching TVs, movies, cartoons. You've probably seen things on shows, comedies, cartoons about people going to a psychiatrist, going to a psychologist, right? And you'll notice on this slide that there's this thing called the talking cure for neuroses. You might not know what that is, but I bet you've seen before video or shows of people that are lying on a couch, and they're sitting there lying on the couch explaining to some counselor, some psychologist, some psychiatrist, everything that's wrong with them, everything that they think, maybe describing dreams that they have, and then the psychologist is sitting here taking notes, right? That is Freudian psychology, and it makes up a lot of modern psychological thought. And so what's really going on there with this talking cure or this thoughts on the couch that are happening? Well, Freud believed certain things about humanity, and he believed these things as just purely factual. Now, when we get to the misconceptions and misinterpretations of Freud, I'll go through a little bit of what he didn't say. But for now, I'm going to say what he did say. All right. So Freud believes that we're made up of three parts: id, ego, and superego. Okay. The id is probably best described like your instincts, the stuff that's deepest in you. Okay. That id is the stuff that is what you really want. It's the stuff that you go after. It's the stuff that you deeply, deeply, deeply desire in your gut. Then you have the ego, and the ego is the reality. Okay, the ego is the reality that comes into a conflict with the id, right? So the id is saying, I want this, I want that, I want to take advantage, I want to exploit. And the ego is that part of us that somehow comes into conflict with that, and it recognizes the realities in the world and that those things are frowned upon. The superego is your morality, and your morality is pushing down on, because of the ego, your superego is the morality that pushes down on that id. And so we're, in a sense, there's a war within us, okay? And this war within us comes out with neurotic behavior. Where does Freud think it comes out? It comes out in dreams, okay? And that's why he was so into dream analysis. It comes out in our neuroses, and this is why psychoanalysis and talking about the things that we do, the problems we exhibit, the neuroses like our nail biting, like our stomach problems, all of these neuroses that we exhibit, these habits, these nervous tics, right, whatever the mental illness, however extreme it gets, are because we're at war with the id, and it's unhealthy. Okay, and so we're at war within ourselves. And so Freud believes that we can let out these and heal these neuroses through psychoanalysis, through dream analysis. We can talk about what's really going on within us, and then we can start to discover those internal urges, okay, that we all really have. Now, there's some pretty weird stuff, okay, that comes out of Freudian psychoanalysis. I always talk about, for instance, the idea of the Oedipus complex that probably some students have never heard of this. You're going to come across it at some point in your life, this idea of the Oedipus complex, if you've ever heard of that. It was discussed by Freud after an ancient play in the Greeks, Oedipus Rex, and in this play, there is a son who goes off to war and comes back after many, many years, and through a non-realization ends up falling in love with his mother. And it was a Greek tragedy, okay? And this was played out on stage by the Greeks as a tragedy. And so people are, of course, freaked out by that. And they're saying, oh, what on earth? You have an Oedipus complex? Well, that's what Freud talked about. And Freud talked about that we have these unconscious urges, which we in reality know we cannot deal with, but in the id, they are still existent. And so he would say that, for instance, all males are in love with their mothers. That is the first person who they find attraction to. Okay. And so that's part of the id. But the reality says, well, I can't be with this person because they're my mother. And so it starts off this war. Do you understand the conflict that he's talking about? Now, some people took ideas like this, okay, and they decided to make them what they wanted to make them. Freud did not think that a good solution for the problems in humanity that he had supposedly discovered was for people to have an incestual relationship with their mothers. That's not what Freud said. A lot of people who followed Freud didn't necessarily read Freud, okay, who was personally pretty puritanical, some people say. They instead said, oh, you know what Freud is advocating? That we let out everything in the id. And so this sparked, especially in the 1920s, it sparked this experimental lifestyle where people said you should have open marriages, open relationships, open sexuality with whoever and whenever, and whatever gender you want, and that this should all be free, and that we should let our id out, right? And so we can act in any way we please because that's healthier. That isn't what Freud said. What Freud said is just that there's this conflict within us. He just recognized the conflict. He didn't advocate the idea that by letting out the id, that society's problems or that personal problems would be solved. He just stated these things as realities. But in the pop psychology of the day, they led to a lot of ideas about Freudianism that weren't actually around in his early psychology. They were like pop applications. But you've probably heard of an Oedipal complex, or you've probably heard of what people call sometimes a Freudian slip. If someone says, oh, that's a Freudian slip, they're referring to, oh, you said something, all right? And sometimes it can be something sexual, or sometimes it can be something non-sexual. But in other words, it's like, say, you said what you really meant to say, right? If you messed up your words or you let a thought out and someone says, oh, Freudian slip, what they're saying is you let in what you really wanted to say out of your mouth because it escaped. The superego filter failed, and you let out something that you really want or desire come out of your mouth. Right? So neuroses, psychoanalysis, Oedipal complex, Freudian slip, all these things come about from either misinterpretations and communications or correct, depending on what category they fall into, out of modern psychology and Freudianism. Certainly, this had some conflict with traditional Christianity's interpretation of what is wrong with man is sin, and what is needed is a savior, not what is needed is psychoanalysis and talk. That's not to say that there can't be such a thing as Christian psychology. It's just that at their very core of what is wrong with man, while you do see some stumbling over truths, you see some inability of Freud to come up with a workable solution for the really deep problems that man deals with, which is competing desires. I think Paul even talked about this in Romans, where he says, I find myself doing the things that I don't want to do. He talked about the conflict that is within humanity. But Freud, he did not have too much to offer as far as a spiritual level of dealing with these problems. He may have come up with some things for talking about these things and bringing them out into the open, but they did not solve life. And that's really the theme of a lot of this video, a lot of new ideas, a lot of new thought, but it brings about a lot of uncertainty in the modern world. And we're going to see this uncertainty and man continuing to wrestle with this uncertainty in our next discussion on modern art. And so I hope that you've taken all this in. This has been a long lecture, and I hope that you are understanding it well as a bridge into our next chapter. All right, guys, thank you for your patience today, and have a good one.